Hello students, welcome to this video tutorial on Comparing Decimal Numbers Review Part 2. Alright, at the top here I have a handy place value chart just to remind you of the place values columns after the decimal place. Okay, so let's begin with section A, reading decimal numbers. Okay, so when we read out these numbers, normally just in daily conversation, the first one, question A, we would just say 0.12, but there's a more formal, sophisticated way to reading decimal numbers, and this is how we do it. All right, so what we want to do is we want to highlight, and it's good if you have a highlighter and a couple different color pens. You always want to highlight the number in the last place value column. Okay, this is very important. So what you're going to do is that number, you need to identify what place value that number is in, what place value column. So this 2 would be in the hundredths column. So once you've identified that, then you just write down, this is the second half of your answer. So let's write down hundredths. Okay? Now to get the first part of your answer, all you need to do is you look at the decimal and then you just read the number after the decimal place. So if I ignore the 0 in the ones column and if I ignore the decimal place, I just read this number from left to right. And that number is 12. So the proper way to read this decimal number is 12 hundredths. Okay, so what if we were to write this number as a fraction? Well, that's pretty easy. So what we do again is we read that number after the decimal place, and that becomes the numerator. So in this case, the numerator is going to be 12, and then the denominator is simply going to be the place value column that the last number is in. In other words, it's going to be hundredths. So 12 hundredths written as a fraction would look like 12 over 100. Okay? All right, let's go through the steps in question B. I'm going to use my highlighter again. Going to identify or highlight the last digit in our number. So let's figure out what place value column the 3 is in. Well, we have the tenths, the hundredths, the thousands, and the 10,000s. So the 10,000s is very important because that's the second half of my answer here. So I'm going to write 10 thousandths. Okay. Now, to figure out what goes in front of that, again, I'm going to use red, and I'm going to read this number after the decimal place. So I'm going to read this number right here, and I'm going to pretend it's a whole number. So I'm going to ignore the 0 in the ones column, and I'm going to ignore the decimal point. So if we were to read this number from left to right, what would it be? It would be 503. So you might be asking, well, what about this 0 right here? Well, if we were to pretend that this is a whole number, we wouldn't put a 0 in front of a whole number, would we? So the proper way to read this decimal is 503 10,000ths. So how would we write this as a fraction? Okay, well, remember, a fraction has two parts, a numerator and the denominator. So the numerator, again, is the number we read after the decimal. So the numerator in this case would be 503. And then the denominator is simply the place value column of the last digit, which is right here, 10 thousandths. So we write 10 thousandths. So this decimal of 0.0503 is read as 503 10,000ths, or as a fraction 503 over 10,000. Okay, let's go on to question C. Again, using my highlighter, I'm going to identify or highlight the last digit in our number. So what place value column is this 5? Well, let's count from the decimal. Tenths, hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, 100,000s. So now that I've identified that, let's write the back half of our answer here. 100 thousandths. Okay? All right. So how do we get the front half of our answer? Again, we read the number after the decimal place. So this number right here. And that number happens to be 10,045. 10,045. So this decimal would be read properly 10,045 hundred thousandths. Kind of a mouthful, isn't it? All right, how would we write this answer as a fraction? So again, fraction has two parts, numerator and denominator. The numerator is the number we read after the decimal, 10,045. And then the denominator is simply this number right here, or the place value of the last digit, which is 100,000ths. So we write in 100,000. All right, so 0.10045 can be read as 10,045 hundred thousandths, or as a fraction, 10,045 over 100,000. Okay, so the last example, I've added a little bit of a twist, but let's follow the steps that we know. So with my highlighter, I'm going to identify and highlight the last digit. So let's see what place value column the 9 is in. So let's count from the decimal, tenths, hundreds, thousandths, 10,000ths, 100,000ths, millions. Okay, so I'm going to give a little bit more room here for something else. So I'm going to write my place value column, millions. Okay. All right. So to get the next part of the answer, I'm going to read the number after the decimal place. So I'm going to read this number right here. Well, if I were to pretend that this is a whole number, this 0, this 0, this 0, this 0, we wouldn't really read. So that whole number, if I were to pretend this is a whole number, is simply 89. Okay, but if you're looking closely, you'll see that there is actually another part of this question. And that is, this question has a whole number in front of the decimal. So how do we handle this whole number? Well, it's not very challenging at all. Okay, so this 16, simply, we just bring it over here, 16. And then we need to have some way of identifying that the decimal place is between the whole number and the decimal. And in order to do that, we use the word and. Now, I'm only drawing it or writing it in all capital letters because I just wanted to emphasize it. Normally, you wouldn't capitalize it. So this number read out loud would be 16 as a whole number and 89 millionths. Okay? All right, so if we were to write it as a fraction, we're getting pretty good at this by now, I would hope. The numerator is 89. The denominator is million. And then how do we handle that 16 whole number? Well, you know what a mixed number is. We put the whole number here in front of the fraction. So a mixed number is simply a whole number combined with a fraction. So this is the fraction of 16 and 89 millionths. Okay? All right, so that is section A. Let's go to section B. Writing numbers greater than or less than or between numbers. All right, so you'll see this question quite often. So let's go to question A. Write two numbers bigger than 0.009. So when we're working on these, especially when you're just starting, it's good to have a little bit of rough space for some rough work. Okay, so if I look at this number, 0.009, the 9 is in what place value column? Well, it's in the tenths, hundredths, thousandths column. So I need a number that's going to be bigger than this 9. Well, the problem is the number bigger than 9 is 10. So all we need to do is think of a number that is bigger than 0 in the hundredths column. Because we can't really have a number bigger than 9 in the thousandths column. So any number here that is bigger than 0 here would be bigger than 0.009. Because if you think of this number, 0.01, if we pretend that there is actually a 0 behind it, because there is, it's just invisible and we don't write it, we can see that this number clearly, 10, is bigger than this number, 9. Okay? So that's one number that's bigger than 0.009. So can you think of another number that would be bigger than 0.009? Well, how about 0.002 or 0.003? Now, if you were really smart and you really wanted to impress your math teacher, you'd come up with a number like this. Oops, sorry. How about 0.012? Well, let's compare that to our original number here. Okay, and this is where stacking your numbers, lining up all the place value columns is very handy. So this was our original number, 0.009, and this was the number we just thought of, 0.012. So if I were to compare the last two digits, 09 and 12, this is clearly larger. Okay? All right. So I've given you some strategies there. So let's use those strategies with the next couple of questions. All right. Write two numbers smaller than 0.0001. All right. So let's do some rough work down here. Okay. Now, the key to these questions is to always remember that after the last digit in a decimal, there can be an infinite number of zeros placed after it. So I'm just going to place 1 0 after the 1. So if I look at the last two digits here, I need to think in my head, okay, so what's a number smaller than 10? Well, a number smaller than 10 would be 9. So I'm just going to line up my place values here. So I'm going to put a 0 in this column. And then, of course, all of these zeros have to be brought down as well. And there we go. I have 0.00009 is less than 0.0001. Remember, the 1 has an invisible 0 behind it. Okay? Now, if I want it to be really smart, I can just pretend that there is actually even another 0 behind the original number. So now, let me just rewrite this over here. 0.0000100. Now, if I focus on the last three digits here, I want to think of a number less than 100. Okay, well, a number less than 100, how about 0.82? 82 is less than 100, and I just have to fill this place value. Then I bring down all of the zeros here. And there we go. 0.0000082 is less than 0.0001. Okay? This answer is if you really understand your place value columns. Okay, so let's go to the last one. Write two numbers between 0.0005 and 0.001. Okay, so let's write the first number here, 0.0005. Now here's where it's really important that you write neatly and that you line up your place value columns. All right, then I'm going to write the next number. I'm going to leave some space in between. So 0.001. Now remember the trick? Any decimal you can imagine has a 0 behind the last digit. Okay? So let's now compare the last two digits of these two numbers. We have 0.5 and 1.0. In other words, you're trying to choose numbers between 5 and 10. Well, when you look at it that way, this question becomes much, much easier. So for example, how about the number 0.6 and 0.9? 6 and 9 are between 5 and 10. But remember, these numbers are not 5 and 10, so let's fill in the rest of the place value columns here. See how lining up your place value columns is very important? All right, so these two numbers here, 0.0006 and 0.0009 are between 0.0005 and 0.001. Okay, I hope this made sense. Good luck on your homework. Thanks for watching. Bye.